Good morning, everyone. Boker Tov. Today's Rosh Chodesh Adar, the beginning of the happiest month on the Jewish calendar. This week's Torah portion is Terumah. The word Terumah means an offering, a donation. Someone once said, what is the greatest nation? A donation. And there's a lot of truth to that. You see, this week's Torah portion talks about the fundraising campaign for the building of the Mishkan, for the tabernacle, the first building campaign in Jewish history. And then the Torah goes into great details about all the materials of the construction and the vessels and the design of the first house of worship ever. And the question is, why name the Torah portion the portion of Terumah, which means donations? The donations was only a means to an end. The real goal was to build a tabernacle, a Mishkan. It should have been called the Torah portion of Mishkan, sanctuary. And the answer perhaps is that in last week's Torah portion, or 2 weeks ago, we read about the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, where God revealed himself into this world. And so what's new about this week's Torah portion is not that God is going to reside and dwell amongst the Jewish people. The novelty of this week's Torah portion is that unlike the revelation at Mount Sinai, where God's presence entered the world through an act of God, in this week's Torah portion, God enters into the world through man's actions. By man, by the Jewish people, giving generously, which requires them to be selfless, to overcome their ego and their desire to be selfish, and but give of themselves. That's the way they brought God's presence into the world. And therefore, it's even a greater level of connection to God, because it's not a gift from above to below, but it's through an act of devotion from below. And that's why the word Terumah in Hebrew means offering or donation, but it has a dual meaning. It also means elevation, because when we give generously, we become elevated in that process. And that is why this month is the happiest month of the year. What is happiness? Happiness can come through pleasure and enjoyment, but as Viktor Frankl says, the greatest happiness comes through meaning and purpose, through giving, not through receiving. And therefore, if you want to be happy, focus more on giving and doing for others and finding meaning and purpose in your life. And therefore, it's when the Jews were partners in bringing God's presence into the world, through their act of generosity, of terumah, of giving an offering, that's the higher level of connection to God. And that's the way we become elevated. And that's why the name of the Torah portion is Terumah, offering, donation, because the donations was not just a means to an end. God could reveal himself without the generosity of the construction of the Mishkan. But Terumah is the end into itself, because we become elevated through the act of giving, through those acts of doing, from overcoming our selfish desire to keep everything for ourselves that we've worked for, but rather to give of it, and not just give of it, but as the Torah portion says, nediv lev, to give it with joy and generosity of the heart, not just generosity of the hand, to do it with a smile, with joy, to give with love. You know, one of the tragedies that happened, of course, in Turkey, over 40,000 people perished in these earthquakes, and just yesterday there was more earthquakes. And the place hit hardest was a town called Antakya. And the Jewish community there goes back 2,500 years, from this time of Purim, which is the story of the Megillah that we're going to read during this month as we celebrate Purim. From the year 300 BCE, there's been a Jewish community in Antakya. And there's a synagogue there. And it was destroyed during the earthquake. And there were only 12 Jews living in Antakya. And the president of the community and his wife, as well as 2 other Jews, perished in the earthquake, tragically. And there are only 8 remaining Jews, and they were airlifted, flown to Istanbul, which marks the end of the Jewish community in Antakya after 2,500 years. And there's a story in the Talmud about the city of Antakya, which in the Talmudic times was called Antioch. And the Talmud says that there was a very rich man. And one day the rabbis came collecting money for the community. And this man had fallen on hard times and lost all of his wealth. And so when the rabbis came, he hid in his house. And his wife said to him, "Why are you hiding?" He said, "Because I have nothing to give the rabbis." The wife said, "But don't we have one little field left?" He said, "Yes, that's what I use to sustain ourselves with." She says, "Why don't you sell half the field and give the money to the rabbis?" So he listened to his kind wife, and he sold half the field and gave the money to the rabbis. As he was working the next day in the field, the half a field that he had left, he was trying to plow as deeply as possible to get as much grain, when suddenly his ox broke its leg. And when he went down to help the animal, he started to dig, and he found a treasure. And the Talmud says the treasure was so valuable that he became wealthier than he was before he lost his money. And when the next year, when the rabbis came to collect, he gave them a very generous donation. The rabbi said, "We want you to know something, that last year, although you didn't give us the most generous donation, we put your name on the top of the list because you gave, even though it was very difficult for you to give. You only had one field left, but you gave half of what you had, and you gave it with joy, with a good heart." And what this story teaches us, obviously, is that the more we give with our heart, and sometimes the more challenging it is to give, the greater the reward. And not just the material reward that this man found the treasure, but the reward of joy, of happiness, of fulfillment that we get. Because the more difficult it is to give, the more we have to overcome our own nature to give, the more of an elevation we receive in our personal lives and in our connection to our fellow man and to God. Have a happy month of Adar.